everybody. This is Friday, August the 21st. This is Anne de Geest. This is the Anne Insights channel. This is the second video. Today, I'm going to keep it a bit shorter because I think last week was 15 minutes and people like to get a bit shorter. So I'm just going to give some key updates. We're going to talk about some interesting data or scary data about COVID creating type 1 diabetes in kids. So more to be studied there. The immune system, the long haulers, some interesting good news, maybe from the southern hemisphere there. If you haven't seen my first video, please take a look at that. There's a lot of great news where the US is slowing down from 77,000 daily cases to 50,000. Unfortunately, there's a second wave in Europe. That's very important. We need to learn so the same doesn't happen to us again when we reopen too quickly and we go straight back up again. And so let's take a look. One of our listeners has done an amazing job. He surprised me last week putting together a PDF, which I have posted on YouTube, that has a timestamp of all the prior videos since the end of May. And it gives you the exact timing on the video on the different subjects. A lot of people have asked me, where can I find more about this and that? So please take a look at that. It should be a link. It's going to be on each video description and also on the introduction on the channels there. So we're keeping this short this week because I'm in California. And if you're in California, the amount of stress we're going through is just off the charts. You may not have heard that, but we had very strange weather a week ago where we got 12,000 lightning strikes for 4 hours during the night. We couldn't sleep there because it was just like a show. I mean, you know, the lights were like nonstop. As a result of that, we got 526 fires. And the problem is you can see pretty much all of California is burning. It's unbelievable. Where I am is that I'm right here off, you know, very close there from what's called this fire here, which is uncontrolled. They don't have enough firefighters. They're not doing anything to control it. And one of the problem with all the fires, this is the map of California that go from Los Angeles here all the way to the Oregon border there. This is the prediction of what's going to happen next Tuesday, which is they expect the wind, which is right now coming from the north, to start moving inland. And what that means is that this is a toxicity of the air index of over 300. 300, if you have 1 day of 300 toxicity, you will have damage to your lungs. And so California is really overwhelmed, to say the least, between that and COVID. And just for the fun of it, you know, they found West Nile virus in my neighborhood a week ago. So we got spray on top of all this. So I'm going to keep this short. If I'm not there next week, I may have had to evacuate. So just be aware, if I'm not there, just hang in there. So why is that important? The problem is that a lot of those toxic air has the same symptoms than COVID. Soreness of the throat, swelling of the sinus, you know, problem in shortness of breath. And so, you know, please stay indoors if you're in California there, because it is going to get worse in the next several days. Hang in there. And I will probably put on the website some of the link to some of this really cool website that tells you what's going to happen. So quick summary of COVID. If you remember, there's a spike. And there was a mutation of COVID that came from Germany in March that has 5 times more spikes and is even more stable. And it attached to the ACE2 receptors inside the body. And that is the problem of this virus. That means it goes everywhere in the body, which unfortunately is a lot of places where there's an ACE2 receptors. And it duplicates itself. It grows a lot of little babies there and releases them and goes exponential in its growth. To give an idea of the size, this is a little virus there, a 0.12 micron. And this is the idea of the sand beach. And this is a really, really, really tiny little thing. And that's why it's so important that you wear a mask with 2.5 microns and be as protected as you can, because this thing is floating in the air because it's so tiny. And that's the problem of the spread. And again, if you haven't seen the prior videos, we talked a lot about masks last week and the prior weeks. So what do we know for sure? A quick reminder. Typically, people have no symptoms, what they call pre-symptomatic, between the time that they get infected, which unfortunately it takes 10 minutes to get inside the nasal cavity there into the bloodstream, so it's very fast. And you can have absolutely no symptoms from 2 to 5 days. In addition to that, another group of 30 to 40% of the people, they have not enough symptoms that they think they're sick. They're called asymptomatic. So there's a difference between pre-symptomatic, which is pretty much everybody for during several days. And this is at the peak of the viral load. This is when they're the most contagious. We know that most people get mild symptoms around 80%, but we're going to talk about that's just misleading there because we're discovering that the long haulers are affecting that population there. And then around day 5 to 10 or 4 to 9, a group of around 20% end up being in the hospitals there where they suddenly lose control of their immune system response. And that's what we call the cytokine storm. So now more and more there's a recognition that the long-term damage is a real problem there. In the last few weeks, we talk about this being a risk. We don't know yet is how long the antibody works, which is an issue with the vaccine. And the good news is that we think the T cells can be activated by the vaccine. And so maybe the T cells are much more important than the antibody. So we're learning all about this. Quick summary, spend more time on July the 31st. We spent a lot of time on all the different symptoms. And one of the problems you can see a lot of these could be tied to a big fire, like a wildfire in California there. So people are having a hard time distinguish one from the other there. So we should expect a lot of confusion in the coming weeks. The immune system, deep dive last week on the immune system. I'll give the background because we're giving some updates. We have the antibody, which is the B cell. They're the one that attack the virus when it's outside the cell. These are the ones that don't last very long. These are the ones we're concerned that 30% of the survivors don't have antibodies after a few months. And then we have the T cell, which are also called the killer T cells. They are the one that kill a cell that's infected. So there's a difference between attacking the outside of the cells and the cell that's infected there. There is more and more data coming out of what's called cross-reactive T cells, which means you have been exposed to a common cold before or another type of coronavirus there, and your body looks like it looks similar. And the reason why it's important is that 20 to 50% of people in a petri dish, so outside the body, when you expose their blood to this COVID, it reacts to it. That means that there is a memory there, which may explain why some people have mild symptoms and other people have severe symptoms if they don't have it. And the numbers are stunning. In Germany, they found 34%, Netherlands 20%, Singapore 50%. In Vietnam, which has a lot of bats there, they have also a very low incidence. So that may be something that may explain why some people, everybody gets infected, but you have a different response. And so some of the new data, and this is a kind of a cool picture of a cell being a T cell fighting the virus, is that you still get infected. So I think there's a lot of confusion there. If you have T cells and prior exposure, you still will get the infection. It's the severity that we're hoping the T cells can protect you there. So it doesn't give you immunity, it's some protection. We don't really know yet if there's a direct correlation with less serious outcome. And the reason why it works is because a lot of these fragments are very similar. For example, COVID-19 share much of the same protein that a good chunk of the common cold that has been in circulation there. So a lot of us have been exposed to the common cold, and so therefore we have a little bit of a protection in the body. So that's kind of good news. So hopefully it could decrease the severity, but there's another word came up this week to say, or it could be what they call original antigenic sin. It's basically, it tried to say is that there are the disease called the dengue fever. And it turns out the first time you get exposed, you have a good reaction, your immune system kicks in. It turns out the second time you get exposed, the body it gets worse. The infection you have is worse. So we don't know yet if people who have had these T cells, the second time they get exposed, do they get a better protection or do they get a stronger reaction? So to be determined. So just to give you the heads up, this is the latest science. No, it's, we're learning literally on a weekly basis there. So good news, but so this is a surprise that came out this week. It turns out in the UK, they did a study. It's a small study, so we have to make sure. But they discover all these kids developing type 1 diabetes. And then they start doing the analysis and they find out they all had COVID. And they were developing type 1. And type 1 means that COVID is probably attacking the pancreas in some form or shape in small kids. And as you know, type 1 is a bad thing because if your pancreas is damaged, that's for life. And so the discovery is that there was twice the normal rate of onset in the UK hospitals for type 1 diabetes. In addition to that, there's data from China and Italy who are also confirming a high incidence of type 1 diabetes. So don't assume that your kids are safe because they have a good innate system there. Some of them, it's still a small amount, may end up with this, not only that multi-inflammatory response we talked about a few videos ago, but more importantly, this is kind of really brand new, this type 1. And they believe that the pancreas, the spike protein, has a way to attach into the insulin-making cells and stopping the production of the insulin. And hopefully, that is something we need to be really aware. There's more research to be needed there, but just be really careful with your kids as we're opening the school. A quick recap, there's some new news on the long haulers. If you remember, the long haulers are people who are survivors of COVID, which could be from mild, the 80% of the people from mild to medium, as well as people who are hospitalized there. And what we're discovering, which is really bothersome, is that the CDC has now confirmed that up to 30% of people across all age, and regardless of the severity of the infection, from mild symptoms to severe symptoms, develop long-term problems several months after they have recovered. And there was an organization there that has now tracked over 98 symptoms. Please take a look. We spent a lot of time last week on this. I just want to recap some of the updates. And at the high level there, it's affecting the lungs. They get fibrosis, and they've shown this on the CT that people have damage. And we know that in 2003 in the SARS, 17 years ago, those patients who got a CT scan have the same damage today, i.e. it's a permanent damage, which means it will basically decrease your ability of breathing right. The Chinese show that 94% of people who were hospitalized had some type of CT residual lung damage. That's massive numbers there. The French have shown another study showing that 23% of severe patients, again, people in the hospitals there, have some type of acute pulmonary embolism, which is also, it's like a stroke inside the lungs. And then it creates a hypertension, what's called chronic pulmonary hypertension, which means that you were totally normal and suddenly the body no longer can manage hypertension for the rest of your life. So we also have now called the COVID fog. And COVID fog is people who probably had inflammation of the brain, maybe some small TIAs, trans-ischemic attack, or mini strokes. And they show in Wuhan that 36 to 46% of the patient have neurological problems. These are eye-popping numbers. And I think it hasn't fully hit the press yet. But the reason everybody's arguing about the fatality rate, who cares if it's 1 or 2%? If you come to me and says I have a 30 to 60% chance of being permanently damaged for the rest of my life, I would really care. And so I think please spread the word, because I think that is going to be the iceberg that we are not fully understanding the consequences of this. Cardiology, they've shown inflammation of the heart, which can lead to congestive heart failure. They did an analysis using echocardiography and functional MRIs, and you can really see this damage to the heart. Some of it could be reversed if people can act upon it and get diagnosed early enough. 12 to 19% of people who were hospitalized in China had cardiac injuries. So these are really serious numbers. Chronic fatigue is pretty much 100%, and the persistent loss of smell. One of my members I talked to yesterday, they still don't have their smell back. It takes a long time for the nerve to regrow itself. So let's look at the news updates. So this is some statistics there. So there's an organization that did a survey. So they're self-organizing them by the patient, self-reporting them. And the interesting part of this survey is that look at the age groups. It's across age group. It's not the old people who have this problem. It's across all ages. Mount Sinai is doing a study in New York, and Dr. Petrino is charging it. It's the first rehab center in the US that has opened up. I think there's going to be more. Their experience so far is mostly women, young people around the age of 45 years old. And the perception is that it could be 30% of the 5 million US cases. That could be 1 million people that we need to take care of. That will overwhelm the healthcare system again. The thing that's really interesting and surprising and worrisome is 2/3 of these people there have negative antibodies. They were tested positive with the viral load, which is a PCR test. And then a couple of months later, where they're complaining about all these problems, they don't have antibodies. There's clearly something linked with the immune system not building antibodies and the long-term damage, which means the virus is still probably working its way through the system in some form or shape. There's a disease called dysautonomia. And it's basically, it's a damage to the autonomic nervous system. Sorry, there's a typo there. And bad news about the autonomic nervous system, this is the unconscious part of you that controls your breathing, your heart rate, your blood pressure, and digestion. These are your basic reptilian, functions there. And as a result of that, they see these people there who were like athletes before, young people, very great shape, who cannot go up the stairs. They're having problem, with oxygen levels. They have unsteady heartbeats. And so that will be tied to the autonomic nervous system there. And that's really bad news because that's fundamental to how we live. They have what's called post-exertional malaise. Every time they do exercise, and I'm talking going up a flight of stairs, they're exhausted for a couple of days. I mean, we're not talking about just running out of breath. I mean, these are like massive, massive chronic fatigue. There's a perception there that, it's called encephalomyelitis, which is an inflammation of, and so to be seen, but these are really worrisome numbers. And as a result of that, people are self-organizing. There's a support group on Facebook. There's a group called Body Politics who just emerged in the last few weeks. They got 14,000 people who just signed up. And so if you have any of these symptoms, or if you know anybody that after a couple of months still is not right, please make sure that they connect with those centers. This is some recent data just came out from the CDC about the mortality rate for the minorities. And you can see that the burden between the percent of the population, which is the Hispanic population, is around 18%, is the pretty much 33% of all the cases. The Hispanic population is really being hit hard, and so is the Black population there. I mean, it's clearly the white population has a lower number of cases there, but I think it's nothing to do with ethnicity. It's really based on social demographics. People are in high density, poor area there, and therefore higher chance to be exposed. For example, we had this big outbreak in the Central Valley in California there as the Hispanic population there went to pick up all the agricultural crops, and they just went from farms to farms on a weekly basis there, and of course they had an outbreak. The data analysis from the CDC showed that 16% of Hispanic workers can do remote work, but that means 84% have to go work outside in a high density and therefore at higher risk there, and same thing for the Black and the Asians there. So that's totally linked to the social demographics. As a result of that, the Black population has a 3.7 times higher fatality risk than the white population. The Native Americans are even a worse problem. It's 5.3x hospitalization rate. And unfortunately, they have been kind of ignored in this crisis there because we're just being hit in every direction. Good news. I try to find good news. So I was talking to my friends from Australia and Chile, and they were telling me that there is no flu. It's the winter there. We're all very worried about, how are we going to deal in the winter in the US coming up with the flu and COVID. And what happens is that because people are wearing masks and they're doing social distancing and they're washing their hands, guess what? The flu is not being spread. And so I did some digging there, and you can really see in 2020, there's a very, very low amount of flu right now compared to what you would see in 2019 and 2017, where the whole southern hemisphere was hit. And if you look at the data, you can really see here, there's no flu. There's a flu out there, it's not being spread. So that would be great news for us in the US, because that means that we're very worried about having a double hit in the winter there. If people continue to take social distancing and wear masks, the flu may not be a big issue. That's good news. So Chile, South Africa, and New Zealand, they have very low incidence. They have also much higher flu vaccination. So the combination of school being closed, travel restriction, mask and distancing, they were able to control the flu. So big lessons for us to learn going on forwards there. So airplane data came out that, airplane may not be as risky as it looks. So let me kind of walk you through this. There has been very few documented cases of in-flight transmission. There were 2 cases. One, there was a JAMA study where 2 people flew from Tel Aviv to Frankfurt, and they were in the back of the airplane, and there were 7 people who were infected but did not know it, and the people across the aisle, so basically on the other side of the plane, got infected, and that was linked to those people there. There was another flight from the UK to Vietnam when one person that was infected managed to contaminate 14 people. Again, same idea. People across the aisle are much more exposed than people behind or in front of the row, so it's still a risk. So why is that safe? The air replaced every 2 to 3 minutes. I'm talking the new planes, not the really old ones. There's a filters that's very high grade, trapping 99.99% of the particle. And people are wearing masks. And so the air may not have a lot of aerosol and droplets. And this person there from MIT calculated that the odds of catching the virus in an airplane for a few hour flights, 2 to 4 hour flights, is 1 to in 4,300. If the big risk is who's sitting in your row, is kind of the big issue there. The other thing that's happening is that having a shield is highly recommended and is not compulsory in some airlines. And that's because you can still get the virus, or you can accidentally touch your surface and then touch your eye. So what most of the airlines are starting to do is to say, okay, we're going to request and require that you have a mask, but in addition to that, have a shield. So for example, Qatar and Philippine Airlines have just announced this week that you cannot fly on the airlines unless you have a shield and a mask. And that's really to protect yourself, because that's one of the transmission, is you accidentally touching a surface, especially in the aisle. The aisle is usually contaminated because everybody's touching the aisle seats. So just be aware of that. Let's continue to keep an eye on that. But I have a shield. I have attached a shield to a hat, so I just pop it in there. And, it's kind of nice because it gives you that extra protection. The testing is unfortunately in the US deteriorating. You can see the number of daily tests have gone down, and unfortunately, it's kind of following the same amount of the daily cases. So we want to make sure that we don't have less daily cases because we don't do less testing. We want to make sure we have less daily cases because we have less infected people. And it has been a big problem, as you know, with the CDC and the FDA. And this week, it just got announced, in fact, today, that the FDA is backing off of regulating testing. That is very worrisome because if you remember, they were backing off of doing the antibody testing in March and April. And we had all this copycat testing there that were absolutely unreliable and inaccurate. So I just hope we don't get to the point where we don't trust the testing results. A lot of the problem there is because right now we have a Cadillac. The way we're doing testing, we use PCR, which was really developed for research. And it needs reagent, it needs to have a thermocycler, you need a certain type of nasal swab, and then you need to do 100 million amplification so that you can see enough of the data to put a fluorescent dye and measure it. Okay. And so it's really good to know, because if you really are concerned with this very, very low amount of viral load, do you have it? It's irrelevant, because what we want is when are you contagious? And when you're contagious, you have hundreds of millions of those virus there. So what we need is to stop trying to get this ultra accurate with the high sensitivity and specificity test that doesn't have the capacity of handling it. And if you get the results in 14 days, it's absolutely useless, which may be one of the reasons why people are not going to do any testing. Because if it takes you 14 days to get the results, which is the situation right now, it's useless. Why go for that? So we absolutely need to find what's called a contagious test, which may not be as accurate and as sensitive as the PCR test, but can give you basically a point of care. And so we need to change the terminology, and I hope the FDA is dealing with that. I was stunned today when they decided to back off of regulating testing equipment there. We don't need a virus test. We need a contagious test. That has to be in the saliva, so you don't have to basically pick the skin to get the blood. It should be a thin paper that's at the point of care wherever you are, which could be at the office, at school. That gives you a 15 minutes detection of the spikes, which is a company called E25 Bios. So the spike is what we know is attaching to the ACE2 receptor. So that's what we want to look at, because that will tell you you're highly contagious. And so right now they have a test that they're trying to go to the FDA with 70% sensitivity. But remember, the load is so high in that period from 1 to 2 days to 7 days. That's when people are basically passing the virus on, that it is sensitive enough to basically detect people who are contagious. And there's another approach, which is to do 10x pooling, where you basically take 10 people, put them into one test. And if it's negative, you don't have to test it again. If it's positive, you just test all the people who are in the pool. So we need to start changing the way we think about testing. We need to stop getting that Ferrari, that perfect, ultimately so precise that you can detect a tiny amount of virus, because it's irrelevant. By the time you have such a low level of virus, you're like probably day 14 into the disease, and you're no longer probably contagious. What we want is to see when you have a high amount of, and we need a Model T, as I call it. And Model T is a surveillance test. It tells you when you are pre-symptomatic, remember, 0 to 4 days, and to your asymptomatics during that viral load peak there, are you contagious? Because that's what we care about. That's what we need for the school. That's what we need for work. And so therefore we need the FDA to back off, but not to walk away, which is what they did today. So I need to do more work on exactly what happened today. So to allow these less sensitive tests to be available in the stores before you go into a stores or in a restaurant, so that you know people are safe around you there. There was to give you an idea, the US government has spent $8 billion for early vaccine orders, but we have only spent $248 million in developing alternative testing. We need to spend money to develop those tests. The country cannot be safe and people are not going to be comfortable until they have a very quick test that you, when you go to work, you put it on there, you do a quick test, and within 10 minutes, you know if you're contagious or not. Same thing for the store, the restaurants. So there are what's called antigen tests. The antigen test doesn't look for the virus proteins, but they look at how your body is responding to the spikes, and that's what is detecting there. And that's 15 minutes. And there's 14 million test capacity coming up in September, which is in a couple of weeks. But the bad news, they need equipment and reagents. So we're back to that problem there. So two companies there to keep an eye. It's Quidel and Becton Dickinson. Those are two big companies there. So we need a coordinated federal effort, which unfortunately is not happening. The same way we did the Liberty ship during World War II. We basically made these ships, a ton of those. They were not a perfect ship, but they were good enough to hold the water. We need to do the same thing here, where we out-volume the virus with tests. And that is desperately needed. You know, there's a big problem in nursing homes. For example, nursing home, the CDC gave the nursing home some of this testing there, but they didn't give them access to the reagents or the cotton swabs, which of course you can get. So we need to be smarter. Please help me there, because that's what's needed for us to get control. So where are we in the world? There was a perception that to get herd immunity, we need 60 to 70%. There was an article that came out today by mathematicians coming in to say, well, maybe it's 46%. It doesn't really matter, because if you look where we are overall in the world at less than 10%. This is over time. You know, some of the data has been published there. Today came out the data from India, which is eye-popping. New Delhi has 29% seroprevalence. That means 29% of the people in New Delhi basically have antibodies. They tested 21,000 people, so that's a significant sample, so it should be representative. And this is the interesting part. 51 to 58% of people who are living in poor, high-density area had antibodies. This thing is spreading like wildfires. We know in the US, the highest one is New York, which is estimated to be in Manhattan, I should say, above 20%. New York, the state, is lower than that, and the same thing is for New Jersey. It's a lower number there. You can see New York State is 14 versus Manhattan. And then it's all over the places. We talked last week about the UK, and the UK really surprised everybody with a number overall to be around, in London to be, I think, around 13%. Again, same thing we're seeing in high density cities like New Delhi is. And so it's far from the herd immunity. So we cannot just assume, we have enough people out there. Yes, you have a lower chance of getting it, but you can still get it. So we did a very big review last week, so I would highly recommend that you take a look at the video of last week. There's no new update except that J&J is, for example, setting up a massive trial of 60,000 people to start testing the viruses. So all the trials are progressing. There is no huge news one way or the other there. But, it's still progressing. Amazing efforts by the private sector. CDC reported that over 40% of people have mental health struggle, and I think California is about 80% right now. And this is, I think, if some of you are parents or have loved ones that are young, 75% of the younger population hasn't built the resilience of dealing with this uncertainty and these changes there. And especially people who haven't finished high school or have never had a high school diploma, they are essential workers there. So these are eye-popping numbers. So I digged out, thanks to somebody, an analysis done for the state of Washington. And what they were saying, and I'm going to spend a few minutes on this one, is that there's the natural human reaction to disasters and how we respond to it. And, pre the disaster, you get the warning and the threats and all the confusion there in the press. And then you have the impact, and somebody, or you see what's going in the news. And they call this the heroic attempt, where you just say, we're going to be there, we're going to try this and all of that. And then there is what's called the disillusion curve, which is I give up. This is out of control. I don't trust anybody, and doomsday scenario there. And then people go there, and this is when they could go into deep depressions, anxiety, alcoholism, and all the other things. We'll talk a bit about that. And then, as soon as the end of the event, and that's the problem, the outbreak is not over. The outbreak could be 12 to 18 months. So if you look where Washington is, they have a long way down. And that's what's really worrying the Department of Health, the employers, is that, this is going to get worse. And people need to take away the stigma of mental health and just dealing with that. So to give you an idea, they already have seen an increase of 50% of people that develop substance-related disorders, which is, cocaine, narcotics, alcoholism. The interesting part is that most of them were not existing. They were not new cases. They were people who were relapsing into this. And one of course, alcohol is the first level, and then people go into higher drugs. Surprise, surprise, marijuana liquor sales went straight up in May by 44 and 31%. That was one of the coping mechanisms. Domestic violence, unfortunately, is up 17%. And there were a lot of cases also in New York that they saw there during the peak of the epidemic. People get so anxious they just can't control their emotions. And then they think that the peak will be 6 to 9 months post outbreak. I'm mentioning this because we're not even close to be the end of the outbreak. And so I really I've been emphasizing this every week. It is a massive thing that's going to hit this country, and I'm not even talking about the election that's not helping, and all these other issues there, and now in California of the wildfires there. We have to help people build resilience. There is light at the end of the tunnel. We will all go through it. And we need to help each other, which is why I'm doing these videos. I'm doing these videos to give you facts, the best science facts, so that you have a sense of control. And please share with other people there, because that's what it's going to take for people to get through this really big dip there. This came from the Washington State of Health. So the concern that they're having, if we continue to have this peak and valley, which is what has happened today with the virus, which is the blue one, there is a delay of around 3 months for having the same type of problem with behavioral health, which is depression, anxieties, people overdosing, and I'm talking serious, not just having the blues, but really becoming dysfunctional. There's a very big concern, and we talked about this several months ago, that if it happens like in 1918, that the second wave that will come this winter will be worse than the first wave. This is 1918. Most of the mortality happened during the second wave. That we have a massive crisis on mental health that is going to come at us. And the Department of Health are already overstretched with COVID. Now in California, we're stretched with people having places to cool off because we have a heat wave and we have the smoke problem. So I think we're going to get to the point where, we're going to be at the breaking point. So I want you to look at your friends and your loved ones, keep an eye on the symptoms where people are starting to lose it, and you need to intervene and help them. So it also is impacting children. As we're opening the school, what they see is that these kids are regressing. They're getting inward. They're getting isolated. They act out. They blow up. They just, they're like a 2-year-old, if some of you know my jokes. And more importantly, they start developing education deficit. Now, if this was only for a couple of weeks, that wouldn't be a big deal. We'll recover. But we are talking about this online learning that could last, for a couple of semesters there. So if your parents keep an eye looking at this negative behavior, this nasty way of maybe hurting, animals, or being nasty with their parents there, because that's when they are overwhelmed with the negative emotions there. So take a look. There's a toolbox that can be downloaded from the Department of Health of Washington State. I'll put it on the website. And then we need children to face their fears. I mean, this thing is not go away. We have to help them face it, give them hope, telling them there's a process, that we're doing the best, and we're all in there together there. And then they don't develop technique, what's called anxious avoidance, which is these are ways to cope. And some of these coping mechanisms could be eating and obesity and diabetes. And there's a lot of things there we need to keep an eye on. So parents, please take care of yourself, because if you don't take care of yourself, you're going to basically trigger reaction by being over anxious and irritable, and your kids are going to even amplify that. So I'm just taking a pause here because it is important. It's not just voodoo California thing. It is important. So what they recommend is that we start improving our learning and listening skills, observing, the difference. Use supportive communication. Repeat what people are saying. What I hear you say, and then you kind of express their emotions. That you don't challenge them. You kind of tell them you're hearing them and you're listening them. Don't argue with them. Offer support. Try to get external activity. If you're over your head, reach out, get help, in some help there. There are a lot of tools. I put a few here. There's a company called Journey Meditation that's like a Peloton with live coaching, with people doing meditation. So the person is there real time with you in a class setting there. There's other ones which are more standardized, computerized, like Calm and Headspace. For example, if you're part of Kaiser, Kaiser offers this to all their members. You have to kind of find on the website, but it is on the wellness there. So please use those because you need to count. And a lot of people have anxiety to the point they cannot sleep, then they get insomnia, and then you get into a cascade that's very negative there. So I really thank you for listening to the end. Please share the knowledge there. We have to help everybody by giving them data, take control. And hopefully I'll see you next week. And the wildfires will go somewhere else and stop burning my neighborhood. Thank you very much, and please post to your network.